Russia has suffered more losses in Bakhmut than Ukraine has done. And then he goes on to say, as a result, there is a possibility of launching an offensive now, before the Russians have the ability to mobilize again. But this will be difficult. The Russians are well dug in and have had ample time to prepare for a potential Ukrainian offensive, committed to a war of attrition. Interesting how Mr. Mack finally acknowledges what Douglas Macgregor, Scott Ritter, Brian Beletic have been saying for months, going all the way back to the summer, that the Russians are fighting an attritional war in Ukraine and are winning it in consequence. But anyway, committed to a war of attrition, Putin has demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice both troops and military hardware. Again, what's the evidence of that? As both Scott Ritter, Brian Beletic and Douglas Macgregor have all said, on the contrary, Russian approach has been one of economy of force, of avoiding losses whilst inflicting maximum losses on Ukraine. But again, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to discuss this in further detail now. Committed to a war of attrition, Ukraine must identify and exploit Russian vulnerabilities and act decisively. For this battle to succeed, Ukraine needs everything, everywhere, all at once. The United States and its allies need to send the Ukrainian military more modern equipment, including more Patriot missiles and many more Leopard 2 and Abrams tanks, and do it today. Do it today. It's so simple. All you do is send hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, tanks, Leopard 2 tanks, Abrams tanks. Of course, don't worry about where they come from, whether stocks of these weapons exist. I mean, you just send them everything you've got, and not just tanks, obviously, but Patriot missiles. There's a general shortage of Patriot missile systems. This is widely acknowledged, but well, those kind of considerations don't really apply. We should send, well, not just one battery or two batteries or three batteries of Patriot missiles. We should send many, many more. 5, 10, 15, 20. Well, it was in fact Zelensky who said that Ukraine needs 20. And then he goes on to say, this is what Mr. Mack says, the fall of Ukraine would bode ominously for the future of Europe and the United States. We need to send a message to the Russians and the Chinese that the civilized world will not back away from this existential challenge. Now just take a step back and think of what he's just said. Earlier, he admitted that the war in Ukraine, one whose appalling effects he is describing with total accuracy, the tragedy this country has suffered, the thousands of people killed, the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people killed, the orphaned children, the devastated cities, the collapsing economy, the women pressed into the military to make up the numbers. And all of this is happening in the context of what he himself calls a proxy war. And why is this proxy war being fought? Well, I'm going to suggest that, without meaning to, he's given away the purpose. He says that the United States needs to send a message to the Russians and the Chinese that the civilized world, what is the civilized world? India? It's neutral. Africa? It's also neutral. Latin America? Neutral too. Most of the Asian states? Neutral as well. Many of these countries are sympathetic to Russia, in fact, in this conflict. The civilized world, the United States, in other words, and Europe, that the civilized world will not back away from this existential challenge. Now, just think of that. It's all about sending the West, which Mr. Mack effectively says, because conflating with the civilized world, it's all about sending a message. All this death, misery, destruction is all about sending a message to the Russians and the Chinese. And in order to make it all completely clear, he says this is not only about Ukraine, but it is also about the future of democracy around the world. If Russia is allowed to turn Ukraine into a proxy state, it will embolden Xi to do the same with Taiwan. This is unacceptable, and it is up to the international community to take a stand. The world, and especially Europe, has lived through the horror of appeasement and must awaken to what is at stake in Ukraine. The time to act is now, and we must act decisively to prevent Ukraine from falling to Russia. Now, I'm going to say straight away that the things that Mr. Mack says are so close, so identical, in fact, with what was said at that meeting described by Spengler for Asia Times, that I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder whether Mr. Mack might have been one of the participants in that meeting. But just take a step back and think about this. This is not a war about Ukraine. It's a war about something completely different, about sending a message to the Chinese and the Russians. And it's a war which is about something called the future of democracy around the world. Notice that Mr. Mack has already used that word, the civilized world. Again, an expression I find troubling, to put it mildly. He's effectively conflating that with the West. He might not intend it so, but if you think about it, that is what he means. He then talks about the international community as if it was the same thing as this civilized world that he's talking about. And he makes it a little clearer when he says that the world, especially Europe, has lived through the horror of appeasement and must awaken to what is at stake in Ukraine. Horror of appeasement, again, conjuring once more memories of what happened in Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. So, to be totally frank, I think that this is an analogy that is so wrong at so many levels that, it just leaves me astonished to think about it in that way. Let me just say make two quick points. Firstly, this war has happened ultimately, in my opinion, for two reasons. The first is because NATO would not cease expanding. In fact, it's expanding again today. It's about to incorporate Finland, to take over Finland. Finland, which has been a neutral country, which no one has threatened, which prospered for many decades as a result of its very good, stable relationship with Russia. Finland, without any proper debate inside Finland, without a referendum or anything like that, is now, as of today, once more a member of NATO. So, expansion of NATO done in clear violation of promises given to the Soviet and Russian leaders at the end of the Cold War and in the years which immediately followed. So that's one reason. And the other reason is because Ukraine refused to grant even limited autonomy to Donbass, despite the fact that it was required to do so by the Minsk agreement, which it itself signed. Instead of granting that autonomy, instead of negotiating with the leaders of the Donbass, as it was required to do by the Minsk agreement, it repeatedly attempted instead to assert its authority in Donbass by force. Now, the Minsk agreement does not, in fact, make any requirements of Ukraine beyond that. It did not require Ukraine to change its foreign policy orientation. It did not require Ukraine to carry out any fundamental changes to its economic policies or anything of that kind. It required Ukraine to grant autonomy to Donbass, agree the terms of a new constitution, which would enshrine that autonomy in constitutional law, and then hold elections, internationally supervised elections, to form a new government. That was all it did. But of course, Ukraine refused to comply with the Minsk agreement, and the United States insisted on and the Western powers insisted on their right, even duty, to go on expanding NATO forever. And the fact that other countries, like Russia, opposed this, the fact that this provoked or precipitated a crisis within Ukraine, specifically within Ukraine itself, that, according to Mr. Mack, has no bearing at all on the situation we find ourselves in now. Now, I have to say, I consider all of this really appalling thinking. Let me say it again. I don't think this is a war. This is the issue of appeasement has any bearing to this, in this. People who constantly bring up this topic of appeasement are in effect making all negotiations of any kind all but impossible. The only negotiations which they seem willing to countenance in any particular conflict are negotiations which end in victory for the side that they are backing. And that's not a negotiation at all. That's not any kind of route to a diplomatic settlement. It is a route to a war. Nor do I think that the future of democracy is threatened by what is happening in Ukraine. On the contrary, democracy is being threatened in the West by things which are happening in the West, which I'm going to come to shortly. But there, of course, we come to the key point, because when Mr. Mack and people like him talk about the future of democracy around the world, it's not difficult to see what he means. After all, it's he who's talked about the civilized world. It's he who's talked about Europe. It's he who's floated again the spectre of appeasement. What he means by democracy is the perpetuation of the liberal hegemony of the United States and its friends. I say liberal hegemony. The word liberal should be in quotation marks, because, to be very clear, classical liberals of the 19th century and later would have found nothing very liberal about it. Well, there we go. Mr. Mack understands that Ukraine is losing the war. He understands the tragedy this is causing to Ukraine. But he doesn't look for a way out through diplomacy, through peace negotiations. His solution is more war, war to be fought with vast supplies of weapons provided to Ukraine today. Don't worry where they come from. Don't worry about depleted stocks of these weapons. Don't worry about logistical issues. Don't worry about training. Don't worry about organising forces. Don't worry about any of these things. Just provide the tanks, the machines, the Patriot missiles, all of those things in vast, extraordinary numbers. Again, I mean, magical thinking, if ever there was any. And do all of this, fight this war in order to send a message to Moscow and Beijing. A message which in some way, not made entirely clear, is intended to secure the perpetuation, the prolongation of Western power, which is, of course, referred to instead as the future of democracy around the world. I have a feeling that if I were ever to meet Mr. Mack, I would probably like him. Unlike many neocons, he does seem to have a genuine feeling for the tragedy of war. He talks about the women who've been called up. He talks about the devastation of Ukrainian cities. He talks about the pain of the children. All of that I can completely share. But the tragedy, his tragedy, the tragedy of so many people, is that they seem to be locked into this vision which they seem unable to break free from, but which traps the West, Ukraine, the Ukrainian people into this war, which he all but effectively admits Ukraine is going to lose. I don't think I have read a more depressing article about the conflict in Ukraine than this one. Anyway, let me now finish with a few further general comments about the state of things around the world. John Helmer at Dancing with Bears has written an exceptionally fine article about the coroner's inquest in Leicester into the deaths of certain British passengers on the Malaysian airliner that was shot down over Ukraine in 2014. And he rightly highlights the extraordinary way in which this inquest was conducted, at least my understanding of how an inquest ought to be conducted does not in any way correspond with what happened. And I think that Helmer brings this out very, very well. And he also points out that this is now forming part of a pattern. And it certainly is. And it's a pattern which I find quite extraordinarily depressing. Now, going back to Mr. Mack and his article, he talks about the future of democracy. And I said that the future of democracy is not being threatened by what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. They're not the only people involved in this conflict in Ukraine. That point needs to be made clear. The future of democracy, at least in the West, is threatened by things which we are increasingly doing to ourselves. And I have to say this, that the collapse of due process, or rather the failure of due process in much of the West, is now becoming for me a matter that is causing me acute depression. Well, I've discussed many times the events in London connected to the case that's been brought against Julian Assange. Helmer has talked about the conduct of this inquest. There's also the extraordinary legal games underway in New York connected with this indictment of Donald Trump. Now, I've had a number of people writing to me very helpful pieces about the statute of limitations point when I talked about the indictment of Donald Trump, and pointed out that the charges which were being brought against Donald Trump appeared to go against the statute of limitations. Now, what people have been doing is that they've been sending me the federal statute about violations of electoral expenses law. But I think I would just make the observation here, and I do this with some humility because I don't pretend to be an expert in this area of the law. But as I understand it, Donald Trump is not being charged under that federal statute. That is a federal statute which is administered by the federal courts of the United States. The case that is being brought against Donald Trump is a fraud case. It relates to apparently fraudulent changes in company records, and it is being made according to the laws of the state of New York, and it is those laws which say that this sort of case is statute barred. In other words, is time limited. That is my understanding of the position, and I just wanted to clarify that. But all right, courts can from time to time, if they're minded to, extend limitation periods. I've seen it done many times. I'm not convinced that this is that kind of a case, but never mind. The point is, just consider what kind of a case this is. It's a case which attempts to take an issue of election financing, which is a federal matter, and it's trying to prosecute it by constructing a case around the doctoring of company records. Has already, to my mind, deeply controversial. In fact, I would say straightforwardly that I don't think a prosecuting attorney should be doing that kind of thing. If the federal agencies are not prepared to bring a prosecution for breach of the overriding statute on electoral expenses, I don't think it's the job of courts of prosecutors in a state like New York to try to reproduce the same effect by manipulating other felonies intended straightforwardly for other purposes. But it goes much beyond that, because I understand that the indictment charges Trump with 34 individual crimes. Now that is ridiculous, and that already should act as a major warning that this is not a real good faith prosecution, at least not one in my eyes, because 34 felonies, 34 separate counts in an indictment is clearly ludicrously over the top. It's intended, and it's an extraordinarily shabby device, much frowned upon, as I know. It's intended to present a jury with a vast menu of offences, of charges, and basically offer them, well, if you don't think he committed this one, well, I've got another little one that you might convict him on. It's something that should never be permitted. Charges should be meaningful and proper. And the very fact that this is done in that kind of way, to my mind, already confirms that this is a case of prosecutorial abuse. How could it happen? Once upon a time, I would have thought it inconceivable. Once upon a time, I would have said that Donald Trump, being charged in this way, would be confident of being able to walk free from the court, because it is inconceivable that any court properly constituted could convict him. After all, even journals like The Economist in Britain, which is unsympathetic to Donald Trump, to put it mildly, have cast doubt on this case. Unfortunately, and this is what brings me back to that coroner's inquest in Leicester, I am very far from confident any longer that this is the case, because in case after case that I've seen cases succeed which have been brought, as far as I can see, on blatantly political, partisan grounds, and which once upon a time would have been thrown out of court, but which are conducted and pursued and result in convictions. Because, and I get to say it, straightforward political biases. The case of Michael Flynn and what happened to him even after the Justice Department itself asked for the case against him to be dismissed and the judgment that had been entered against him to be overturned. The case of Michael Flynn is just one case amongst several. Now, once upon a time, I would have considered this impossible. And again, I'm not here, I don't have any brief for Donald Trump. I don't say that Donald Trump is spotlessly clean. He clearly isn't. I don't believe his story, for example, about his relations with Stormy Daniels. Just to make that observation. But the point is not whether Donald Trump is a good person or not. It is whether or not the law is being impartially applied. And it seems to me that it isn't, and that there is no certainty any longer that because this case has no merit, it will necessarily fail. And that is a terrible situation to be in. Now, I'm just going to finish with something taken from fiction. And that is that in Germany, over the last couple of years, they've been broadcasting a drama series about events in Berlin in the late 1920s and 1930s. It's extremely well produced, and it shows the state of events in Berlin. It's called Babylon Berlin, and it focuses a great deal on the actions of the police force in Berlin during that period. And one of the secondary characters that's appeared is a man called Hans Litten. Now, Hans Litten was a real person. He was a lawyer practicing in Berlin in the 1920s and 1930s. He was a rather edgier and more abrasive character than he appears in that particular film, that particular series. And I noticed the series rather understates his rather strong political views, left-wing political views, which brought him very close to the German Communist Party of that period. But anyway, notwithstanding, he was an outstanding lawyer, and he did conduct a series of very brilliant defences of people at that time. He was a brilliant criminal defense lawyer, and he's also famous because he subpoenaed as a witness in one of his cases a certain mustachioed gentleman from Austria, who eventually became Germany's chancellor with catastrophic consequences for Germany and Europe. And he subjected this man, Lytton did, to relentless cross-examination, which that particular individual never forgot and never forgave, with dire consequences for Lytton in the end. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about Lytton more. There is an extraordinary scene in this series where Lytton is sitting in a courtroom. He's trying to defend some journalists, and what he discovers suddenly is that everything has changed. The judge is no longer interested in hearing evidence. He, in fact, refuses to hear any defense evidence at all. He refuses to hear any defense submissions at all. He receives a note from the prosecutor, which he reads, but won't share with Lytton. He then immediately goes, and after a hearing that lasts perhaps 10 minutes, he goes forward and simply orders conviction of the defendants who've not been provided with any opportunity to defend themselves, either through Lytton or on their own count. And then after further consideration, he metes out a harsh prison sentence. And Lytton is sitting in the courtroom and he's absolutely dazed. He's astonished by what has happened. He can't believe it. He's been brought up all his life functioning within a legal system, a functioning legal system, and he sees it collapse in the courtroom where he is sitting. And what makes it even more surreal for Lytton, this is, as I said, the fictional Lytton, not the real one, is that even as that happens, everything else, life, or so it seems, carries on as normal. Nobody seems unduly concerned except the defendants and himself about what has happened. The rest of the judicial system seems to function much as it did. As I said, life in general goes on as always, and most people neither know nor care. Except, of course, that as we know, things like that did start to happen in Germany in the early 30s. And then they continued to get worse. And then the mustachioed gentleman took over. And, well, we all know the consequences of that. I have to say that watching, listening to these events, reading articles like Helmer's, I do sometimes feel a little bit like Lytton did in that program. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say for this program today. I hope that the outcome for us is not as bad as it was in the Germans in the 30s. But all of this fills me with deep disquiet and gives me a great sense of foreboding for the future. That's my program for today. I will end it there. I will say that obviously I'll be back with any more news of Ukrainian counteroffensives or those sort of things. We'll see also what happens in Bakhmut over the next couple of hours. And in the meantime, all that remains is for me to wish you a very good day, to remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also go to our shop, buy the amazing things that you will find there. our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those things. And last but not least, if you have liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon.